On September 11th, 1777, General George Washington faced off against General William Howe near Brandywine Creek along the Brandywine River. It is now known as the Battle of Brandywine. Hessian forces also took part in this battle. And unfortunately, for all the American efforts, including that of Marquis de Lafayette and the rearguard actions of Nathanael Greene, the American forces were driven from the field in an attempt to keep the British away from Philadelphia, which was the capital at the time. But George Washington kept his army intact, and they still remained between the British Army and Philadelphia. And achieving independence only requires a stalemate. Therefore, this battle is significant in that it should be remembered as a historic landmark. It has a very interesting history of its preservation throughout the 20th century as well into the 21st century. Multiple organizations actually sought out this land, and during even the early 1900s, as urban sprawl was taking place, as well as the suburbs were being pushed farther out from Philadelphia, there was one developer that sought part of the battlefield for its water supply, as it is near the river. But according to Phil Patton in the Brandywine Valley, preserving the pastoral for present and future, he mentions that they saw that, that such development would actually cause erosion and damage the battlefield. Other interpretations of the land where the battle took place is that there are architects that only are concerned with preserving the buildings, such as the Lafayette House, for its architecture. There are other scientists as well that just seek to preserve the beauty and the landscape of that area. And while this battle is not in the state of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia continues to be a huge obstacle for preservation efforts in or near the battlefield. And according to Stan Baumgartner, the nonprofit Brandywine Conservancy has purchased a very key piece of the Brandywine battlefield in Chester County, Pennsylvania for $8 million. And the very reason is that suburban sprawl from Philadelphia is some 30 miles just to the east of that battlefield, and it continues to threaten the preservation efforts that are continuously launched there. And even though under the same article, it says that the Battle of Brandywine was recognized as a National Historic Landmark in 1961, the designation in no way provides protection against this type of development. Phil Patton, again, mentions how there's also a battle between public preservation and private preservation, and that it seems that this conservancy is a private relief fund. It is privately run through donations given by various people that had preserved much of this battlefield. And unfortunately, neither the state governments or the federal government has funded them enough to preserve much of this land where the battle took place. And on a personal note, I recently went to the battlefield of Spotsylvania Courthouse. I received a tour from a very good friend of mine, another historian, Chris Mikowski. If you have not read his works on the Civil War, I highly recommend it. He was telling me about how he would love to make trails. He would love to create some trails out to some of the grave sites on the battlefields where these small graves were dug. Well, he cannot do that because there are other organizations that would be very upset if they were to make trails because of how it might affect certain bug populations or how it might affect certain plant populations on the ground in which they make a trail. So there are multiple organizations that are always have some interest in these areas. And Brandywine is no different in this. Luckily, the American Battlefield Trust, who they have a wonderful, wonderful organization and website, they've done a fantastic job of not just preserving the battlefield of Brandywine, but many battlefields across the United States. And I always highly recommend supporting their efforts. But ultimately, they recently saved more than 116 acres at Brandywine Battlefield, just through their own efforts to get support from the public, and they raised money to save the land at these battlefields, and this includes the Battle of Brandywine. So if you get the chance, I highly recommend to go to their website and look into that. However, Brandywine is very important in American history, and quite frankly, the reason why I picked it is because it was a very desperate, this battle itself was a very desperate time in American history, and it's important to understand that, especially for students that are studying history, what that would look like, and that even in the face of all odds and in the face of defeat, somehow George Washington was able to pull his army together and come back from this defeat at Brandywine. And therefore, it would be very significant to try to plan field trips around the Battle of Brandywine, as they have multiple buildings that have been preserved, of course, not just by the efforts of the Conservancy, but other organizations. And of course, it is a beautiful, beautiful place to see. But ultimately, of course, such a field trip would greatly benefit any student of history. Thank you.